Okay, Brian's had a varied career of over 40 years of national and international policy, governance, and diplomacy in both public and private sectors. He graduated proudly from the University of Canterbury with a master's degree in history and geography, and worked for 3 years as a secondary school teacher before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1964 and began moving up through the ranks. He was Deputy High Commissioner in Singapore from 71 to 74, returned to Wellington to head the Asian and Pacific Division of Foreign Affairs, dealing with the aftermath of the Vietnam War, beginning tentative relations with China and establishing the Pacific Forum. Then followed a post as Deputy High Commissioner in London and followed by a spell as Assistant Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Wellington before he moved to a role of Assistant Secretary of the Ministry of Transport during the period when all forms of New Zealand transport were corporatised and then privatised as part of the reformation of the state sector. Brian became Chief Executive of the Meat Industry Association in 1992 and oversaw the rationalisation of that sector, including the move from frozen commodity exports to further chilled retail cutting and packing to an expanding number of new markets. He's also been chair of the Trade Liberalisation New Zealand, the New Zealand Industry Foundation, and the Horticulture Export Authority. All the while, he's maintained his connections with the international trade, serving on the Asia-Pacific Economic Council, preparing for the APEC conference held by Zoom last year. In addition, he's been director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, and in his spare time, if he has any, he's written a memoir entitled Points of No Return, which was launched last week. Brian was made an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2004. I'll now hand you over to Brian.
Thank you, Mick, for that. A bit long-winded, but covered the key points. I'm really going to concentrate in my remarks on the diplomatic phase of my career, although as Mick has outlined, throughout that career, in I think every capacity, there was a reasonably significant aspect of external engagement. When I was appointed to what was then called the Department of External Affairs, neither I nor Jan, we were married by then, knew much about diplomacy, even whether it was a worthy role. However, very quickly, we embarked on our introduction to diplomacy. I joined, as Mick said, what was in the Department of External Affairs in early 1964, and because we were moving up from Christchurch, I was assured that we, including our young family, would be given time to adjust to living in Wellington, and the prospect of an overseas posting would not arise for 2 or even 3 years. So on that basis, I was able to assure my parents and Jan's parents that they still have a lot of time to see their beloved grandchildren growing up. Well, 7 months later, we were in New York, and I took up a position at the New Zealand mission to the United Nations, and that led me into what became a full immersion course in multilateral diplomacy. Bilateral diplomacy came later in my postings to Singapore and London. But just by way of a very brief scan backwards, diplomacy as a profession has been around for many centuries, probably as long as law and medicine. It can be traced back to the Middle Ages, and particularly in Europe and the Middle East, when collections of tribes came together and formed nation states, individual jurisdictions. One consequence of which was that individual new nations had to find ways of connecting with and communicating with neighbors. And rulers very soon found that what they needed were envoys, representatives, who could move abroad and help maintain linkages with neighboring countries. And the purpose of diplomacy essentially has not altered over the years. It is to maintain connections, maintain engagements with other countries, whether large or small. Very few countries can aspire at all to any notions of self-sufficiency. Interconnection has been the hallmark feature of international engagement, and the role of diplomacy and diplomats has been to ensure that the wheels turn smoothly. I once heard that the diplomat was said to be somebody who was sent abroad to lie for his or her country. Another aphorism was, diplomat is somebody who can tell you to go to hell and you'll look forward to the journey. But seriously, diplomacy is a most integral part of modern day fabric of the way this globe functions. And for a small country in particular like ours, we are constantly reminded that the world is what it is. It isn't necessarily what you would like it to be. And so if a country size and scale of New Zealand is to make its way in the world, then it has no choice but to maintain and constantly refresh a whirling constellation of connections offshore, whether those connections are with other individual countries, with small groups of countries, or as with the United Nations and its family of organizations in very large conglomerations of countries that form, for example, the United Nations and its family of organizations. The trade craft, as I term it in diplomacy, can be boiled down to a few essentials. What your job is as a diplomat abroad is to formally be the representative of your country and your government of the time. Particularly with a small country, it is constant challenge to get invitations to be at the top table when key decisions are being made. You don't earn that as of right. You have to be invited. Therefore, you have to show, not today and next week and next month, but every day, that you as a country have something to offer. And it is the place of the diplomat posted abroad to be the formal presence of representing New Zealand, whether that's in bilateral context such as it was with Singapore and London, or in a multilateral environment like New York or Geneva. Your job is to, of course, establish and sustain close relations with the government and the officials of the country to which you are formally accredited. And therefore, as I said earlier, part of the role you have is to constantly maintain the impression that New Zealand, small though it might be, has something of value to offer. In our case, I think the image of New Zealand that we endeavour to sustain is of a country that does have value to offer, that perhaps in three brief points of focus, that we are a country and a people who display genuine humility, that we do have something of value, that we are fiercely independent, but that we as well have a steely determination to succeed. So genuine humility, generosity of spirit, and a sustained attention to detail and to achieving objectives is what it's all about, on the spot, abroad. As we've seen recently with the Prime Minister's overseas visits to the US, Europe, Australia, it is critical that every so often the New Zealand story, New Zealand message is sustained not just by diplomats on the spot, but by visits from the most senior New Zealand representatives in the form of the Prime Minister. I'll give you a couple of examples where I witnessed the importance of relationships being maintained at the head of government level. One was during my time in Singapore, when then Prime Minister Norman Kirk came through, and he had an especially close relationship with the Singapore Prime Minister at the time, Lee Kuan Yew. They were fellows in the Socialist International. They knew each other professionally and personally very well. Kirk paid an official visit to Singapore. There was a black tie dinner that Lee Kuan Yew hosted. I was asked to prepare the speaking notes for our Prime Minister, which I did. And when the dinner came and the speeches arrived, I sat back, basking in the balmy Singapore air, relishing the prospect of my golden prose ringing forth. Kirk began by saying, "My dear Harry," he always called me Harry, "my dear Harry." And after that, I did not recognize a word of what he said. The next morning, the text that I had prepared was carried in its full in the Straits Times. When we met with the Prime Minister and party, I apologized for not capturing the sentiments he had hoped to express. Kirk let me down lightly. He said, "Don't worry." He said, "What you wrote about the Singapore-New Zealand relationship was spot on. And the fact that it's now in the Straits Times means that a wider audience will read it. I felt a little bit better after those words of prime ministerial comfort. The other personal relationship that is firm in my memory is the one between Robert Muldoon and Margaret Thatcher. There was real chemistry between the two of them. I remember a lunch at number 10, Muldoon's honour. There were 10 of us at the table. A Foreign Office colleague sat at the far end, one end, and I was at the other. We were both nursing little pads hidden out of sight below the table, on which we were recording, each of us, the conversation between the leaders. There was a point reached where Muldoon had been talking about New Zealand's need for continuing access to the markets of Europe. And Margaret Thatcher, who was sitting alongside him, thumped him on the thigh. And she said, "Now listen, Bob." I had never then or since heard anyone else call him Bob. "Now listen, Bob, I understand you're having trouble with the French." And Muldoon indicated that was the case. Thatcher said, "Well, let me tell you, Bob, there's only one way to deal with the French. You really have to tell them which way is up." She said, "Now, what's your deputy's name again?" "Tallboys," said Muldoon. "Oh, that's correct," said Thatcher. "Now, listen, Bob," she said, "next time when you've got trouble with the French, there's no point in sending a gentleman like him. Next time you come yourself." That piece of unsolicited advice, I recorded on my pad, but I broke the pencil along the way. Those sort of experiences do tend to remain seared in the memory. Of course, there is another side to the diplomatic life. Spending a good portion of your working career abroad, fulfilling a peripatetic career, has implications for family, moving every 3 or 4 years, home and away. And it has implications for, in many cases, for the spouse. Often they have to put on hold their own career ambitions while another posting is followed through. I've discovered in my own case that while certainly life and work in New York at the UN, in Singapore, and in London was enjoyable, professionally rewarding, most stimulating time, I think, overall, was spent not abroad, but in Wellington, in a policy context. I will just mention 3 particular areas of challenge that I encountered. One, as Mick alluded to, came with the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. April, the end of April, Saigon was overrun, the Army of the North, and a provisional government was installed. This development for our friends, other friends in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, the takeover of Saigon was as though their worst fears had come to be realized. We faced a dilemma. Clearly, the political geography in Vietnam had been rewritten. Would this be the prelude to other major changes driven by the authorities in Hanoi? So we had to find a way of being able to communicate with those authorities. We had actually recognized, New Zealand had recognized Vietnam 2 years earlier, but there'd been no serious bilateral interaction. I discussed the options we had with my colleagues in the Asia division. One option was really to go out publicly, beat our chests, and claim the forces of darkness will not prevail. The second option was, in a way, one of policy hibernation. Just sit and wait and see what eventuates. In other words, do nothing. Now, neither of those approaches was going to be consistent with the policy of serious engagement with Southeast Asia that New Zealand had been pursuing for several years. So the third option was to take the initiative and see if we could open up channels of communication with Hanoi. The only capitals in the world where New Zealand and North Vietnam were both represented at ambassadorial level were Paris and Geneva. So we Paris and what was then Peking. So we instructed our embassy in each of those countries to make an approach at the most junior diplomatic level to their North Vietnamese counterparts to convey the message that New Zealand accepted the changes that had happened in South Vietnam and that New Zealand wished to discuss how the future relationship between New Zealand and Vietnam might be progressed. We got the replies back very quickly that the North Vietnamese were interested. And so we then instructed our consuls about halfway up the diplomatic ladder to make contact with their counterparts from North Vietnam. And we provided some more substantial material to be passed over as talking points. Again, the response came back quite quickly and positively. So finally, we proposed to North Vietnam that New Zealand formally recognize the new provisional government in Saigon and that we together contemplate how the bilateral relationship might evolve. And so on, as I recall, the 12th of May, 1975, Bill Rowling, then Prime Minister, was able to announce that New Zealand and North Vietnam had come to a formal bilateral accord. That whole process took about 2 weeks. At any point along that path, the North Vietnamese might have said more or less, we're not impressed, go away. If that had happened, it would have been an enormous embarrassment, humiliation to New Zealand and to our government, but that didn't happen. And the Vietnam-New Zealand relationship from then on progressed. The second policy challenge that I recall was over Timor, tiny Timor, about the size of the South Island with 1 million inhabitants, which at the end of 1975 was invaded by Indonesia. much to our horror and the horror of quite a number of other countries. The policy issue for us here was that on the one hand, we were working quite hard to develop a substantive bilateral relationship with Indonesia, which we saw for the future was going to play an ever-increasing role in the geopolitics of Southeast Asia. On the other hand, and knowing that the Indonesians perceived tiny Timor as a source of insecurity and perhaps insurgency, we were conscious that they might resort to actual invasion. Problem for us was that we had, for more than a decade in the United Nations, helping to set the pace on decolonization. Invasion of Timor would be totally contrary to that approach. The invasion happened, and for over a quarter of a century, Timor suffered under Indonesian control. Here in New Zealand, Timor had its supporters, and they were not slow to castigate the government and its advisors, like me, for what they saw appeasement towards the authorities in Jakarta. It was a difficult time. The third instance, as a policy challenge, I will mention with the Adorned Raids, those heavy-handed activities in the 1970s first started off under Kirk's government and then reinforced under Muldoon to locate overstayers from the Pacific and persuade them to return to their own homes. Notably, those homes were in Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji, three countries in their neighbourhood with whom New Zealand had worked hard and formed very close relationships over the years. The Adorned Raids cast a profound stain on the relationship. I recall quite vividly the very first week in which I had taken over as head of the Pacific Division. We hosted a visit from the then Samoan Prime Minister, Tupuola Efi. He arrived on Friday. I met him in Auckland. We went to Russell for the weekend, where he came down to meet Cabinet. And in conversation, he made it abundantly plain just how upset he was. And he knew his counterparts in Tonga and Fiji were over the Adorned Raids. I was able to communicate on the Monday morning back to Wellington, passing on to Prime Minister Muldoon at the time and Cabinet, who Effie was going to meet later in the day on Monday, just how seriously this issue rated and rankled. And it was 3 years before the raids were finally done away with. In that time, 2 of those years, while I was still in the Pacific Division, I recall at least 12 visits to the Pacific, often in the company of ministers like Muldoon. And the hot issue much of the time, of course, with the Adorned Raids. And while the government, our current government has formally apologised for those egregious actions, no doubt that in the minds of many in the Pacific, Adorned Raids still cast a shadow across relationships. So, folks, that's a snapshot, very brief and light once over, touching on a few serious matters. But to finish off with, I'd just like to mention some of those occasions, a few of them, when things didn't go quite to plan, no matter how meticulously I and my colleagues might have prepared for a particular event, a particular visit. I remember we were in Singapore. Queen and Prince Philip and Princess Anne visited. There was a function for representatives of Commonwealth countries. The Australian High Commissioner escorted Prince Philip, the British High Commissioner escorted the Queen, and I was acting High Commissioner and given the task of escorting Princess Anne. With the three guests were divided in three groups. Queen and Prince Philip, their groups never stopped moving, constantly, quietly on the way. Princess Anne was a different situation. She preferred to stop and talk and have a wee chat with the people she met. The end result was that after 45 minutes of going around these groups, the two senior royals had met everyone, the groups they were with. Princess Anne and I had got about a third of the way around when the whistle blew and the royals had to go off to another function. For many months after, I was one event after another, apologising friends from Commonwealth missions that they hadn't been able to achieve the anticipated opportunity to be briefly with the Princess Royal. I remember Norman Kirk was quite dynamic operator in the international field. He, of course, died, age 51, too early. My last formal engagement with Kirk was in the context of a visit by the Foreign Minister of Japan. And I sat in to take the notes, which I was doing when I looked up, and of course we were in the old government, the old Parliament buildings then, on the third floor. I looked outside, and to my astonishment, there were two workmen on the windowsill outside Kirk's office, moving backwards along the windowsill, trying to get from the windowsill into the building. They eventually found a window, which they were able to open, and slid into Kirk's office, looked around, spotted the three of us, moved, tiptoed, but at speed, to leave the room. Kirk continued without missing a beat. He was totally unaware of what was going on. The Foreign Minister and I had certainly witnessed this rather unusual procession. And we looked at one another, the Foreign Minister and I. We remained inscrutable. There was a meeting of minds, and we turned back to give the Prime Minister our full attention. A third experience that remains in the memory was of the first black tie dinner that Jan and I attended. We went to London, posted to London. It was put on by the Vesti family at Butcher's Hall. I've done it, following you close. A long table. And I was sitting opposite Lady Vesti. And I suspect that I was endeavouring to impress the spouse of a doyen of the New Zealand support group in London. And here I have a small tip for the unwary among you. If you are in full oratorical flight, it is best not to be waving your arms around when the first course is being served over your right shoulder. I watched transfixed in horror as the tomato soup, a tsunami of it, surged across the table and seemed destined to embrace the Vesti cleavage. It stopped just short. It took me a little while to recover what remained of my diplomatic poise. Two other examples, and then I will conclude, of these events that didn't go quite to plan. Early on in my time in London, I had to go across to Belfast. One of my responsibilities was to liaise with the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I was meeting with Betty Williams and Margaret Corrigan, peacekeepers. This had followed the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting earlier in 1979, when Muldoon had indicated that New Zealand would be prepared to receive Northern Irish couples caught up in the Troubles, couples of mixed religious, i.e. Catholic and Protestant faiths. We interviewed a number of candidates, and at lunchtime, we were congratulating ourselves that we had identified some very good possibilities. A nice lunch ensued. When the main course was finished, the plates were taken away. What I hadn't anticipated, that when the waitress carrying about 10 large plates came behind me, she tripped and all 10 plates crashed. I can assure you, 10 large dinner plates falling on top of each other make quite a lot of noise. I reported to Wellington that I thought their representative had set some sort of record for the height reached from a sitting star. The last example I'll give was related again to the Vesti family. They were involved in New Zealand in two areas. One was through the meat sector, and the other because they operated the Blue Star shipping line. In 1980, a new vessel, New Star, was to the New Zealand Star was to be named, was built and to be launched near Whitby. And the launch, formal launch, would be in her capacity as Prime Minister's spouse. Thea Muldoon would be the leading participant. The Vesties, never ones to do things by halves, had booked a train from Euston Station to Whitby to carry their guests. The High Commission was not involved in the arrangements. That was all handled by the Vesti team. So two gins down and a third in hand before we even left Euston Station. I was feeling comfortable with the world. The train took off. At an early point, I looked up and, feeling slightly uneasy, observed Mrs. Muldoon's private secretary coming down the aisle. She stopped alongside me. Brian, she said, Mrs. Muldoon wonders if you could come forward. So, swaying slightly, I followed the private secretary. Met Mrs. Muldoon, who by this time I had met on a number of occasions and knew each other quite well. I sat down and she said, Brian, have you read the speech they drafted for me in Wellington? The launch speech? I said, oh, what do you say? Yes, I did. She said, what did you think of it? I didn't really spend too much time thinking about what I was going to say. What I said was, well, I wasn't too impressed. It didn't read a bit stilted. Didn't seem quite like you. She smiled and she said, that's what I thought, Brian. Would you mind rewriting it? So for the next hour and a half while we continued with that train ride north, on top of a high stool, and I think sobered up, I rewrote the speech, took her back to where she was comfortable with it. We got to near Whitby. I was taken off to the Vestey office to have the speech taken up, typed up, went back to the launch site, gave it to Mrs. Muldoon. She expressed okay, satisfaction with it. And so that incident too came to a close. I think, Mick, I might call it off at that point. And while I might go on longer, maybe some questions. I'd be happy to try to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. We've got a few questions in the chat. Kate asks, can you recommend any books that teach diplomacy?
I could, but I would have to look them up. They've been books written since the 17th century on the essentials of diplomacy. And in fact, the quote I used earlier on at the start about the world being as it is, you have to take it as it is, not what it actually is. That's from an Italian author in the 1800s. But I'd be happy to provide Kate some reading, some suggestions.
Yeah, Kate, if you do want some suggestions, just send me an email.
Yep.
And Brian might be able to help there. Mick's asking, are the rules regarding veto powers for the members of the Security Council still relevant? We hear a lot about that in the news, the veto, Russia has a veto, and I don't know who else has a veto, but are they still relevant?
Well, they are still relevant, and by and large, not for good reasons. At the 1944 San Francisco conference, which led to the creation of the United Nations, New Zealand was one of those countries, through Peter Fraser, time, who voiced considerable dissatisfaction with that element of the UN Charter, which provided for 5 permanent members who have the ability to veto the resolution. And over the years, that power has been exercised primarily by Russia and China, but more recently by the US, certainly Britain and France on occasions when they've disliked a particular resolution, have used that power. And so while there are just under 200 members of the United Nations now, there were about 105 when I was there. The continued existence of the veto has on the one hand, and we've seen this just recently in the Ukraine context, the veto has seriously the ability of the United Nations to take constructive action. Secondly, the veto power throughout UN history has rested with the original 5 members: US, China, France, Britain. But the actual disposition of power in today's world is a lot different from what it was when the UN was set up. And the veto is, in today's world, an anachronism in terms of its relevance or its ability to accurately portray where power lies. There are countries in South America, countries in Africa, who might well claim that their influence is at least some of the 5 quite permanent members. So it's relevant, but not unhappy.
Okay. And Kate's also asked about Machiavelli. Do you think Machiavelli has anything to contribute to the 21st century? It's a big question.
I recall when I was advised by my permanent head at the time, Frank Corner, that he felt I had had long enough in the as head of the Asian division, and I should want me to move and change, become head of the Pacific division. I said I didn't know much about the Pacific. I had observed in New York and the UN work that we've done on, for example, the Cook Islands and Niue, was self-government. Frank said, you'll pick it up quite soon. Essentials. 2 good deputies. But he said, I want you to remember one thing. Particularly, Pacific, South Pacific is the only part of the world where New Zealand has a foreign policy. Everywhere else, we have external relations. Well, that was a bit over my head. So I asked Frank to explain. He said, it's not that difficult. He said, the reality is, a small country, we're only listened to, we're only taken notice of on issues when we make full-blooded attempt to ensure that our views are known and are heard. He said, that lies around the world. But in the case of the South Pacific, here and only here in this near neighborhood, what we do, what we say, how we conduct ourselves, these are critical for our neighbors. If we do things well, they will benefit. If we do things poorly, they could suffer. So remember the distinction he said between external relations and full-blooded foreign policy. Now, where does that leave Machiavelli? Well, the course of world history since The Prince was written hasn't deviated a lot from the points that Machiavelli was making about ways and means in which nations behave in order to pursue their own interests. But in our case, certainly, going back to what I remarked at the beginning, I mentioned genuine humility, generosity of spirit, the reputation of being reliable and a committed participant in the international arena, matched all with an acknowledgement that we work very hard to succeed. Maintain that image, tolerant, values driven approach to our international relations. They are important. But if you look at today's world, and for instance, a few examples, what's been going on, for example, in Eastern Europe in February, Machiavelli would feel quite at home. Okay.
All right, I think that's been a fantastic insight into the world of diplomacy. I've got plenty more questions, but we've run short of time, Brian, but just want to say thank you for your time today. I'm going to hand over to Kirsten, our Social Connection Coordinator.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. That was really amazing, actually, sitting here for the last 45 minutes or so, which is not enough time really to cover your whole career. But Mick tells me you've launched a book last week, so I would recommend everybody gets hold of that and has a, I guess it's got a more in-depth review of your full career. But yeah, just a couple of things I noticed from your talk that I thought that was kind of funny, how you said that they told you that you'd be in Wellington for 2 or 3 years before you went away, but it ended up only being 7 months before you were sent off to New York. And I can imagine what the in-laws said when that happened, although they would have got to have a nice trip to New York maybe to come and visit you. Also, I thought it was interesting, your comments about diplomacy being integral to an integral part of countries functioning on the world stage. And I think probably a lot of diplomacy happens behind closed doors that a lot of us don't see. We hear of big things that happen in the news and media, but I suspect there's a whole lot going on quietly behind closed doors. So yeah, it's really important. Made me laugh when you said that Thatcher called Muldoon Bob. I can just imagine that conversation. That would have been quite fascinating, being in that room when that was happening. And also that your speech that you'd written word for word wasn't actually spoken in Singapore, but then printed in the newspaper. Yeah, I think that he was probably right saying that more people got to read your words than would have heard them otherwise. So yeah, I could point out a whole lot of other things you said, but that was really an amazing talk. Thank you so much for giving up your time today to spend time with us. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten.